Israel decide that this was worth bringing him to trial as opposed to anyone else in the preceding dozen years that Israel had been a nation?
Well, first of all, we received information that he had escaped from Germany, that he was actually a German prosecutor told us about that, and that he was the Argentine, was hiding there, and so on, under an assumed name. But the main reason was, of course, that Adolf Eichmann was head of the Jewish department of the Gestapo, of the police force dealing with the Holocaust. And in fact, he was so fanatical and so obsessed with the feeling that he had to see to it that the whole of the Jewish people in Europe is annihilated, that his commanders, the commander of the security forces in the German, the Gestapo, the SS, and all these forces who dealt with the Nazi crimes, they had lots of departments, and the leaders of all these departments were changed by rotation all the time. The only person who, as head of the Jewish department, was kept there all during the war was Adolf Eichmann, because Hitler and Himmler and Goering and all these people who were in charge of the annihilation of the Jews and decided that they felt that if he was in charge, there's a great chance that in fact millions of people will be killed, because he felt that he not only was prepared to do that, he was not only prepared to carry out these orders that he received, but he was absolutely obsessed with the idea that he was chosen to carry out the murder of millions of people.
Do you think that's how the only way a genocide can actually be carried out is with people that are true fanatical believers? Or was Eichmann a true believer, or was he just a... He was.
Well, he became that. I'm very often asked what made him tick, and I usually refrain from sort of defining people as only something, only a murderer, or only a robot, or only a bureaucrat, or only a Nazi. People are never only something. People are a combination of things and also pass through stages of development. And I think that's happened with him as well. I think at first he became an expert in Jewish matters because he thought it was good for his career in Germany to become an expert in Jewish matters. Then he carried out these things as a bureaucrat. And then, when for years you deal with the murder of innocent men, women, and children all the time, I think you either must go mad in a way, not medically mad, but somehow crazy, or you must convince yourself that you do something which is justified or worthwhile. I think that's what happened to him. And then you could see during the progress of the war, especially towards the end of the war, that it became an excellent identification on his part. And he told some of his friends, I know the war is lost, but I'm still going to win my war. And then he went to Auschwitz to get the death rate increased from 10,000 a day to 12,000 a day. And the way when the German generals on the Eastern Front were clamoring for reinforcement, for ammunition, for manpower, he by trickery managed to get priority for his death trains, although he must have known that he was actually harming Germany's war effort, but he didn't care about that anymore. What was interesting is, towards the end of the war, suddenly someone had an idea, and Eichmann supported it strongly, that every German soldier who was 1/4 Jewish, one Jewish grandfather or one Jewish grandmother, that he must either be sterilized or sent to a concentration camp. Now, the German commander-in-chief of Keitel, he was at that time the commander of the German army, objected, not out of humanitarian reasons, but he didn't want to weaken the army at the end of the war. You know, maybe thousands of people concerned, and they were fighting together all the time. So suddenly to take them away or sterilize them, he just objected to that. And Hitler supported Keitel Again, not out of humanitarian reasons, but he didn't want to weaken the army. For Eichmann, he didn't care about that. Everything which could destroy part of the Jewish people in this way or that way was something that was worthwhile. And therefore, the fact that he was chosen, I can tell you one other thing. I mean, I was in charge of the whole investigation. Now, if I had done that investigation without any person being present, without any prisoner or any suspected person being present, and at the end of the investigation about the Holocaust, he would have asked me, you can have one person to put on trial. There's no doubt I would have taken Eichmann, because there were people of higher rank who were involved in this. But he was the one who represented every aspect of the Holocaust, the planning and the legislation and the taking charge of arresting and all the Jews, sending them to the death camps, the concentration camps, getting the gas for the camps, and so everything that was connected with the destruction of the Jews of Europe was done actually by his department.
Prior to Eichmann, had the Israeli government been interested in bringing Nazi war criminals to justice in Israel?
Well, we had no real hopes that we would be able to catch one of them. But according to the law was passed in 1950. The law for the bringing to trial Nazis and Nazi assistants and so on, and dealing with the genocide. So of course, somehow we had the hope that one day we can catch someone. We were trying to find, we investigated, and we tried to find whether there are any people available. But well, we didn't really have hopes that we would be able to have someone brought here, because in Germany, if they found someone, they also put them on trial in Germany, and sometimes in other countries. But here, of course, with Eichmann, we made a special effort to find out, first of all, where he was, even if someone else wanted to put him on trial. And then one day we got this information from a German high source of the German prosecution, and who told us that this man was under the name of Ricardo Clement in the Argentine. And that's how our Israeli agents managed to get hold of him and bring him to justice in Israel.
You know, when I've taught the class, interestingly enough, some students are bothered, when I taught class on genocide and the Holocaust, are bothered by the fact that the Israelis violated international law by kidnapping Eichmann from Argentina. What was your feeling about that? Pretty clearly, a certain degree of international law was violated by going into someone else's territory. Now, the Argentinians forgave the Israelis after that and said, we don't care.
Well, the moment I was in charge, I mean, after Eichmann was brought here, the Minister of Justice, 2 days after that, after he came here, the minister asked me to be in charge of the investigation, in the sense that I was the legal advisor of the police bureau that was in charge of the investigation of Eichmann. There was a whole prison vacated for that, and Eichmann was there, and I was there for 9 months, actually, in charge of the investigation. I was also the only contact Eichmann had with the outside world until his lawyers came. So the first thing, of course, I thought, what possible arguments could they bring forward? We thought of this point, of course, of the kidnapping, and that there might be an argument that because of that, Israel should not judge this man, because he was brought by Israeli agents who actually committed an illegal act under the Argentinian law. Now, here the answer was not by judgments or principles laid down in, let's say, dictatorial or countries that don't respect the rule of law, but countries like America and England, where they really uphold every minute detail of the rule of law. And here we relied mainly on American decisions. It happens quite often in America that someone commits an offense in one state in America, and then he escapes to another state. And the sheriffs of the state where the crime was committed sometimes follow him and manage to get hold of him and take him forcibly back to the other state, which is actually a criminal offense. And there it was argued a number of times by the defense counsels that that is an unlawful act, unlawful by the state in which it was, where the man was kidnapped, and that therefore there should not be a trial. And this came up to the Supreme Court of America, and they said that if a crime like that has been committed, then if people decide to want to put people on trial with this, it's possible. But that does not affect the jurisdiction of the country that has jurisdiction in this matter in an ordinary way. And that was held a number of times in America. There were similar decisions in England, and this was also upheld by our court, that this does not have any influence on the jurisdiction of the court, then according to the law, it does have jurisdiction to try a man for international crimes committed like that.
What were your fears about going to the Argentinian authorities first and saying, can you arrest him and give him to us? What do you
Well,
fear that would have happened?
people thought apparently the chances that in the Argentine, they knew that lots of Nazis had escaped from Germany or Europe and had come to the Argentine, and people knew that. The idea to extradite him to any country, certainly not to Israel, that chance was very. But of course, I mean, we didn't decide that. I mean, that was decided. I had no idea there was such a plan. I heard about it when this man had actually arrived in the country. But the security agents who were in charge of trying to find Nazi criminals, you see, they heard about this and they carried it out. There was no government official government decision about that. But perhaps an even stronger case, which was even more forcefully argued, was that we knew that the defense would most probably argue, and they did, that here Israel is a Jewish state, and the Jews were the victims of the Holocaust, and therefore justice does not only have to be done, but has also appeared to be done. And the fact that a court representing the community against which this crime was intended and had been committed, that they should judge the person who was in charge of carrying out these acts, that somehow doesn't look just. I mean, that was an argument that was forward. I mean, legally there's nothing to it, because, I mean, the whole idea of the criminal law is that a court representing a community against which a crime is being committed, that court is the one, instead of leaving the revenge to the family where someone has been murdered or where there has been a burglary or something like that, it's a court representing the whole of the community against which a crime has been committed that puts the man on trial. But sometimes people say, yes, but here there are special emotions because of this. My answer was always that any judge who can hear a case like that, facts like that, without feeling somehow some kind of emotion, I don't think he is fit to be a judge. Of course, he has to be objective. He has to give the accused every possibility to defend himself. But no one has ever argued that that was not done by an Israeli court. But what was so typical from in my memory, one was also a professor at the University of Europe who made that argument to me before the trial. And then before I could answer, he said, could you show me the indictment against Eichmann? So I did, and he saw that in addition to murdering and persecuting Jews, Eichmann was also charged with the murder, that his department had murdered gypsies and Russian commissars and Polish citizens and Czech citizens and Russian citizens. So this man looked at it and he said, tell me, why didn't you leave that to the Czech courts and the Russian courts and the Polish courts? So I said, wait a minute, 5 minutes ago, you said that you thought there was something wrong, that if a country or a court representing the community against which a crime has been committed they put someone on trial who has done these things. But you don't seem to have any difficulty with the Russian court or a Czech court or a Polish court doing that. But if it's a court of a Jewish people, suddenly you have that difficulty. The man had the decency to blush. And he said, I really don't know why I made the difference. I'll investigate, I'll think about it and I'll call you. He never called me again. But I mean, that was typical. Another thing I want to add in this connection, and I never forget the first moment of that trial, when these judges, Israeli judges, came into the courtroom with the emblem of the state of Israel behind them. And that man, whose only really task in life had become to destroy that people, when he stood up and stood to attention before a sovereign Israeli court, before a sovereign Jewish state, the importance and the meaning of this creation of the state of Israel suddenly became clearer to me and to all of us. That at any moment had preceded that. But anyway, the argument as such was, of course, raised by the defense, but was not allowed.
To what extent were the procedures of the trial of Eichmann influenced by what had happened at Nuremberg, a decade, a little more than a decade before?
Well, of course, we examined. I mean, the Holocaust was also mentioned in the Nuremberg trial, but I mean, it was never the focal point. It was never the central point. It was one of the marginal things that were raised. That's why sometimes I mean, 47 years have passed since the trial, and the interest in the world about the Eichmann trial seems to be growing from year to year, which sometimes is surprising, because there were other cases where the Holocaust was mentioned, like the Nuremberg trials and others. But as I said, it was never the central thing. Here, it was not only the central point, the focal point, but it was it really described with all the details, and all the aspects of this. And but of course, we studied the Nuremberg trial. I mean, these arguments of the defense, like the fact that, for instance, that this was a retroactive law, that the law was passed. Usually, the criminal law, you don't put someone on trial for something that happened before the trial, before the court was, before the law was passed.
And you're speaking of the law of genocide. And,
any kind of, but here, of course, in the Nuremberg trials, that point was also raised, because here these people were put on charge by a law and thing which was passed after the end of the war. And I was sure that the fact that this law was passed it wasn't passed after Eichmann was caught, but it was passed in 1950, 10 years before Eichmann was caught, but still after the war and after these crimes were committed. So I was sure that this argument would be put forward. But of course the answer is the rule against retroactive criminal law is not a rule of law so much as a rule of justice. And you don't have to be a lawyer in order to understand that really prima facie, that if you do something today which is completely illegal, and then a law is passed 6 months later, with retroactive effect to make it illegal, and then to put you on trial and even perhaps to sentence you to death, this looks somehow preposterous. But that is not relevant to this case here. When we passed that law, putting up a court which could put on trial a person or a number of persons who had committed these offenses of murdering men, women, and children who were innocent, we didn't put up a new norm of law which was not known before. This was illegal under German law. It was illegal under every law in the world. That persecution of innocent people like that, like the idea of murdering people, millions of people who had not committed any crime whatsoever, just because they belonged to a certain group or certain nation or certain religion. That was something which everyone knew and felt. That's why they kept it as a secret at first, even before the German people. And this was actually an international crime, and known as an international crime. Only that the Nazis created a sort of vacuum under which people who murdered Jews would not be put on trial. So if you speak of rule of justice, justice demanded that a forum should be put up after the war to enable courts to put on trial people who committed crimes like that. And therefore there was nothing there which was contrary to
so that the general rule prohibiting what we call ex post facto laws after the fact being passed is an attempt to avoid miscarriages of justice, but in this case it was an attempt to fulfill justice.
Exactly. That's what I mean. This is not a rule of law, it's a rule of justice. And here justice exactly demanded the opposite. And that was held in the Nuremberg trial. And, specifically, the same point was raised and was decided this way. Of course, we studied all the arguments put forward in this. And the same thing in French courts and Dutch courts, all this about laws that were passed after the war. I mean, we went over millions of documents. We received documents also from German sources, you know, all the ministries. We went all over that, and the police officers, whenever there was a document which looked relevant, they gave it to me and they showed it to me, or some other piece of evidence. And I did this in every criminal case. When I came across a document that I thought might be of interest to the defense, I usually sent it to the defense counsel, which I did here as well. And when I saw something about carrying out orders and as a defense, possible defense argument or something like that, so I sent it to the defense counsel, Dr. Salvatio, and he showed it to Eichmann. So he told me afterwards that Eichmann asked him, where did you get these documents from? He said, the prosecutor gave it to me. He almost fainted. He said that, yeah, the Israeli prosecutor gave you documents that might think, how is that possible? He couldn't understand
because Eichmann's argument, his lawyer's argument, was that, you know, it was the just following orders argument. I was merely a cog in this machine, and I really didn't make any decisions.
Right, that's why one of the main things, but during the investigation, was trying to disprove that argument. Even if it's not a complete legal argument, from the point of view of the punishment, it might have made some difference if really he reluctantly or would have been forced to carry out orders because they also did. But here we really show that this man was completely identified with this and completely obsessed. I never forget the first moment of that trial. I mean, not of the trial, but the first time that I met Eichmann. I was sitting in this prison, you know, and I was looking at documents, and I was looking at the document of Rudolf Höss. Höss was the commander of Auschwitz. He was hanged by the Poles in 1948, 12 years before Eichmann was caught. But before he was executed, he wrote his biographical notes. And on that day I read these notes, and I read there that he described how they had these many days where they had to put 1,000 Jewish children to death in the gas chambers. And he described how the children sometimes used to kneel down to be spared. And he wrote, when I had to push the children into the gas chambers, my knees were getting a bit wobbly sometimes. But then he added, but I always felt afterwards ashamed of this weakness of mine after I talked to Obersturmbannführer, let's see, his degree in the SS, Adolf Eichmann. Because Eichmann explained to me that it's especially the children that have to be killed first. Because where is the logic, he said, that you kill a generation of older people and you leave alive a generation of possible avengers who can afterwards create that race again. Now that's maybe not devoid of some macabre kind of logic, but 10 minutes after I read that, people that came and said, Eichmann wants to see me. And he was brought in and sat opposite me like you're sitting now. I never forget, you know, when I heard his steps outside the village, just 10 minutes after I read that about the murder of the children. Well, it was a bit difficult to keep a poker face at that particular moment. One other thing, which was typical for his attitude, of course. Another thing, during the trial, he said that this was the worst crime ever committed in history. It was cardinal crime committed in history. It was capital crime. So I was asked, during the trial and afterwards whether I thought he meant it seriously. Which again, from the point of view of punishment, might have been important if he had really shown remorse. So I said, no, I'm sure that there was lip service towards the outside. So people asked me, why do you say that? Well, I said I could imagine, theoretically and practically, even a man like that he could change his mind between the end of war, 1945, and 1961, when the trial took place. His eyes could be opened. People might have explained to him, can't discount the possibility that a man might see the things in a different way. But here we had proof that in 1956, when he was in the Argentine, he was visited by a Dutch journalist called Sass, the fascist. This man took his life story on tape recording. The idea was that he would publish this after Eichmann's death as a sort of life insurance for his family. But when Eichmann was caught, he gave it to Life magazine, and there we managed to get that. And we also got the transcripts of that with Eichmann's correction in his own handwriting. So knowing that this man was from Holland, he also described, he said how he stood there and he looked at the death trains sending Jews from Holland to Auschwitz. He says, "Es war eine Pracht, it was marvelous to watch that." And then this Dutchman asked him, "Tell me, Mr. Eichmann, do you after all feel sorry for what you've done?" He said, "Yes, I feel sorry for one thing, that I wasn't hard enough, that I wasn't tough enough, that I didn't fight these damn interventionists enough. And now you see the result, the creation of the State of Israel and the re-emergence of that people there." So I said, if he said that in 1956, 11 years after the war, and now in 1961, 5 years later, when he's fighting for his life, he suddenly speaks of the gravest crime committed in history, I think I'm justified to be a bit skeptical about the truthfulness and reliability of such things. But that was typical. We even proved that he countermanded Hitler's orders when he thought that might bring about the saving of a few Jews. A few Jews, I can tell you.
What was that involving Hungary?
That was involving Hungary. There, the Hungary fought on the side of the Germans and the Italians during the war. But the leader of Hungary was a man called Admiral Horthy. He was then in charge of Hungary. And he wanted to make a separate peace. Let's go into details. And he also was not so much in favor of deporting all the Jews from Hungary. So Hitler came to the border and met Horthy. And by threats and promises, tried to influence him to agree to the deportation of all the Jews. Horthy finally agreed, but made some condition. One condition was that the Germans should permit 8,700 Jews from Budapest to go to neutral countries. Hitler agreed, not out of humanitarian reasons, but because he thought it was more important that Horthy should cooperate with him in the deportation of hundreds of thousands of the other Jews of Hungary. Now, how do we know all this? There was the German Foreign Ministry gave us all the documents from that period, and we found there a telegram sent by the German ambassador from Budapest, from Hungary at the time, von Wesenmeyer, to Ribbentrop. Ribbentrop was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time, and he describes the agreement between Hitler and Horthy, including these 8,700 families, but he added, "I have, however, to inform you that the local representative of the SS, Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, was very upset when he heard about the arrangement between the Führer Adolf Hitler and Horthy, because he thinks that these 8,000 and so families that might be important biological material, and they might from these neutral countries even come to Palestine and might create the race there again. And therefore Eichmann, when he heard about it, has given instructions that the deportation from Budapest should now be forced at such a speed that until the visas can be arranged for these neutral countries, no 8,700 families should remain in Budapest." Now, here he had a decision by the Führer, by Hitler himself. So he even tried to countermand that in order to prevent that what he described as biological material might come to Palestine. Now that document I put in with a special stress, because that really showed this is not a small cog, it just carries out orders. This is a man who was even prepared to thwart a decision by the Führer, by Hitler himself.
Now, why do you suppose, I mean, I've heard the argument, I've actually spoken to people who said, oh, well, the Eichmann trial means nothing because it was such a foregone conclusion that he was going to be convicted. But isn't that true in almost any case in which there was a lot of evidence against a criminal defendant? I mean, it's very rare that defendants are acquitted after those circumstances.
Yes. I think anyone that knows about the Israeli courts did not have an opinion like that. And about foregone conclusions. I mean, we did a lot of, put in a lot of work, and also I must say that the judges were very, very strict with us. You know, the judges did not permit us to bring a single piece of evidence which was not absolutely relevant to the Eichmann trial. In fact, I had some difficulty at first with the judges. I mean, after all, the case was started. We did want to bring to the attention of the world also what happened in the Oliver. That was, I mean, the main idea is to do justice in this particular case. But as this was such a special case, of course, we wanted to know what the laws were, what the Nazis did, the Nazi decision.
There's a fairly iconic picture of, here's you in the corner, looking much like you do now. The Attorney General, and here's Eichmann in the glass cage that became perhaps the most familiar symbol of the trial, the man in the glass booth in some respects.
Of course, we wanted the world to know the main documents about the Nazi legislation and so on, and the persecution of the Jews, and the main pieces of evidence. So there were some central documents and laws passed in the sort of famous Nuremberg laws and others. So I'll never forget that. You know, one day I wanted to put in a very central piece of evidence, and I said, I'm now going to read to you the main parts. So I was immediately interrupted by the judges, and they said, Mr. Bach, we can read the document ourselves. You don't have to read it out to anyone. We will do that ourselves. It was that when the judges said that when I wanted to read out the laws, the Nazi laws, and to bring it also to the attention of all the world journalists and the press. And so the court said, well, we're going to read that ourselves, you don't have to read it out. So I replied to that. I said, look, I'm sure you're going to read it all out, that you're going to read it yourself, but we want to show you which are the sections that we pay particular attention to. Why did we hand it? Not all the sections I want, but these are the central ones. And those I want to read out to you. So I managed to get that across. But the court itself, also about people who gave testimony to what happened here or there, all the time I had to prove to the court that this was connected with Eichmann. And they really were, as I said, sometimes really went out of the way to show how completely objective they were and how they tried to give every opportunity to the accused to defend himself. So here, as I said before, what helped us was the fact that the accused was Eichmann, who was really in charge of all the aspects of the Nazi crime. Therefore, also practically every piece of evidence was relevant. Sometimes I'm asked, yes, but what about all the evidence about the death camps where people were put to death where Eichmann was not personally present? How is that relevant to Eichmann? But that's people who don't understand criminal law. If I charge Eichmann being an accomplice to the murder of millions of people, of course I have to see what he does and how he arranged it and how he organized it and how he sent people to the death camps and how he managed to get the gas over there and so on. But in order to convict him of murder, we also have to show that the people were murdered and how they were murdered, even if he was personally not present. Therefore, all the evidence of what happened in the death camps in Auschwitz and Majdanek and Sobibor and Belzec and in Warsaw and all these places that is relevant evidence as far as Eichmann's charge was concerned.
You know, as we sit here, there's perhaps the last of the Nazi war crime trials going to be going on in Germany, which is important to our discussion for 2 points. One, it illustrates what you were saying about the Israeli courts, because even though there was a conviction there and it was pretty clear that he was a very, very bad man during the war, the Israeli Supreme Court ended up reversing the conviction.
Yes, not only that, but who managed to get the information which brought about the final acquittal? That was the prosecutor. The prosecutor who handled the trial about that he was charged with being in Treblinka, Ivan Dominiuk, Ivan the Terrible, and there were a number of witness sources who had identified him, and he was in fact convicted. And then there was an appeal, and the prosecutor went to Russia after there had been a revolution there, and they opened the archives, and people could look at the archives. And there the prosecutor found a number of statements by Nazi criminals who were no longer alive, who had made statements before the Russian authorities. And there they described how there was a very cruel Ivan, a man called Ivan Marchenko, and some of them identified a picture which was definitely not Dominiuk. And that's why he was acquitted. And now he's charged in Germany with having been in Sobibor, and apparently on new evidence, which I don't know the details of, and I mentioned that there will be evidence. There's no doubt that Dominiuk was in a place called Travniki, and he was trained to be a watchman in the death camps, to take part in preventing people to escape and putting them into the gas chambers and so on. So, but we don't know exactly. I mean, then at that time in Israel, we had no direct proof that he was in Sobibor or in some other place. So he was not charged with that again. Now what will happen, we'll see in Germany whether they have sufficient evidence to show that. But the fact that the court was objective here, and that the prosecutor, he was the one who gave that information to the Court of Appeal and to the defense counsel, and managed to get him acquitted.
You know, occasionally I have young students who, in 20s, early 20s, say to me, well, what's the point in, there's absolutely no point in trying a man who's 89 years old for the crimes he committed when he was so young. What's the point? It's over now. Any comment on that, about justice delayed is sometimes worthless at this point? I mean, do you think
well,
it
what
proves
has
something?
to be taken into consideration? I mean, that depends on the offences concerned. I think when I was the state attorney of Israel for many years before I became justice of the Supreme Court. I was a justice then for 15 years. I was for almost 30 years in the state attorney's office, and amongst them about 13 years I was the state attorney of Israel. So I had to make sometimes decisions about that. So the question of age is certainly something which was taken into consideration, and therefore, if there are offences which did not absolutely demand putting someone on trial, then the fact that someone was of very high age was sometimes a reason not to charge it. If it was a minor offence or with some special mitigating circumstances and so on. But if it were, if it was as like here, a man who not only did a technical job of being a watchman or somewhere, but someone who took an active part in taking innocent people into the gas chambers with special cruelties, which was something which was marked for these people. Some of these Ukrainians who volunteered to serve with the SS, then I would say that that's not a sufficient reason to close the file. We charged him here when he was much younger. But now for the Germans, that if they have evidence which is sufficient to show that he actively took part putting children and others into gas chambers than to say to close a file only because he has a very high age. That I don't think it's just, it would be just. Then, before they had the gas chambers, they had gas vans where trucks were used and the Jewish families were forced into these trucks and the exhaust was put to the inside and people were slowly choking to death. And the trucks drove for 30 or 40 miles and then the people were dead and were sent, the Jewish families were thrown away into some kind of ditches. So one day I found a document by an engineer who, either to his minister or his superior officer, he described how these vans operate. And then he writes, I feel that out of humanitarian reasons, we have to do something to protect our poor SS drivers who have to listen to these screams of the Jewish families from behind that are getting softer and softer when people are slowly dying. And therefore I've invented a soundproof wall between the driving seat and this part behind, that our poor SS drivers don't have to listen to them. When I saw a humanitarian reason, I thought something, to do something to these poor victims. But here, humanitarian reason, this connect to do something to protect our poor SS drivers, that they don't have to listen through the shrieks that are getting softer and softer. I mean, when sometimes, after a while, when I read things like that, they shocked me not less than the description from the death camps. Although most of these documents we didn't use during the trial. Because I just want to just tell you what traumatic effect it had also on us when we were preparing the trial.
You were telling me before we started the camera about this one picture of you back here. I just wanted to ask you about it. It's not it's a very striking picture, the look in your eye, and this is not, this has the look about it of something that's posed, where somebody asks you to put this there, or your hand there, and look in a certain way, almost like an actor, but it's not, is it?
It was not a post picture. It was taken, I remember, was taken by from the press gallery by someone immediately after a piece of evidence, which I also never able to forget. It was the only witness in the trial, and I think the only person at all that I've ever heard of who was already inside a gas chamber and was unable to tell the story. He was a child then, I think 11 years old, 12 years old, something like that. And he was taken, they usually took 200 children into the gas chamber. And he was one of those, and he described how they were forced into this, or thrown into this chamber, the gas chamber, how the doors were closed, and how they were standing there in the darkness. And then he described how at first they began to sing to give themselves courage. And then when nothing happened at first, the children began to cry and to shout. Then the door opened. Why? We also had other evidence about that. A train had arrived at the death camp in Auschwitz with a load of potatoes, and there were not enough SS men, the German SS men, to unload the train. So the commander had the glorious idea, why not use some of the children before they were killed to help unload the train. So they opened the doors, they took out the first 20 who were next to the doors, and he was one of those. Then they closed the doors, the other 180 were killed right away by gas. But these 20 had to help. Then they were also killed. But they said that the commander had said that he had committed some negligence during the unloading, and they had done some damage to one of the trucks. And therefore the commander gave orders that he should be sent to the camp and should be flogged and whipped by someone, another SS man, before he's killed with the next group who will be sent to the gas chamber. And the SS man who had to carry out the flogging took a liking to him and kept him as a batman to clean his shoes and do his bath and so on. And this is how he managed to remain alive. And we also had another piece of evidence how On that day, the children who could still work were used for that. But the ones who were too weak or too small, they were chosen to be sent to the gas chamber right away. The Germans didn't want to examine every child at length, so they put up a sort of wicket, 2 vertical sticks in the horizontal one, and the children had to walk underneath that, and any child that didn't come to a certain height was sent right away to the gas chamber. And he was very, he or the other child that also gave evidence there was he was very small and very little, but he had an elder brother who was large, taller, and the elder brother realized his brother wouldn't make it. So the brother took stones and put it in the shoes of his little brother so that he should be a bit taller. And he held him up, tried to hold him up so that he should be higher. But the SS men saw that, and I think he either shot the brother or sent him away at first, and then he was sent right away to the gas chamber. And well, anyway, this description of what happened there was so terrifying that the judges, when this evidence was over, said we have to make a break of 15 minutes. And then I sat down. This was the moment when someone photographed me at the end of that piece of evidence. And I must also say that I was also dazed, that I went into my chambers, and the young defense counsel came rushing into my room and burst into a hysterical weeping attack. He didn't want people to see him like that. I didn't want people to see him like that, but I had to prepare coffee for him to enable him to continue. And it's also something which was rather interesting. Even now, after 45 years, when I was invited to Nuremberg to also give a lecture there, together with the prosecutor in the Nuremberg trials, Wendy Harris, who's now 96 years old, and we became good friends. But anyway, this defense counsel who lives in Munich, he heard about it, and after 45 years, he invited me to his home, and we re-established contact again, and we had friendly relations all the time during the trial.
What's your attitude about people prepared to defend an Eichmann? I mean, defense lawyers who, this lawyer, the other lawyers, did you
Well, there were even Israeli lawyers who were prepared. There is this general principle that every person is entitled to defense. And as I said before, to say that there were no legal arguments or other arguments that one could plausibly try to bring forward. As I say, like the retroactivity and the kidnapping and the fact that the state of the victim, Israel is the state of the Jewish people that are the victims, and this man was carrying out orders and he had to obey it. I mean, all these arguments, it was quite plausible to put this forward. The defense, of course, they didn't try to justify. Eichmann didn't try to justify the acts of Holocaust. On the contrary, he tried to say that he thought it was a terrible offense ever committed. So therefore, I saw no reason or no reason for a lawyer to object to trying to put forward a legal defense. Only that we thought that we had good answers to that. And I spent 2 years with this, 9 months with the preparation, where I was living next to Eichmann in this prison. I was in charge of the police, was legal advisor of the police bureau that carried out the investigation. And then the trial itself, and then on the appeal.
To live with this, how did you sleep? To live with these facts night after night,
I had some
day.
difficulty. I had some difficulty at times. After a while, one even gets used to that, so I had some sleep. But also during the trial, I never had more than 3 hours sleep, because the trial was held in the morning and in the afternoon. Then we had to prepare, sometimes also to inform the press about what happened during the trial, and then to prepare all the documents and the arguments for next day, and then go home. So I hardly ever had more than 3 hours sleep.
How long did the trial actually last?
The trial lasted 3 months. One of the results of the Eichmann trial was that there was a chain reaction of these cases in Germany, which were not held before. There were prosecutors who all the time wanted to bring these people on trial, but they were never given encouragement, and were never given enough budget to carry out these investigations. There were none of these people who took part in these actions in the death camps were put on trial. The same in the schools. There were always teachers who wanted to bring this to the attention of the children, but they were not given encouragement. The parents who were Nazis, they certainly didn't want the children to learn about this, but even the ones who were not Nazis, they didn't want the children to come home and ask them, where were you? Why didn't you do anything again? Why didn't you demonstrate? Why didn't you criticize what was happening there? So they were against it, and therefore it wasn't brought into the schools and not into the courthouse. But then the Eichmann trial started, and from 3 months and afterwards also during the appeal, this was brought into every home for an hour every day. So they couldn't stand in the way anymore of these prosecutors and the teachers who wanted to use that. And so then there were the chain reaction of these trials, and all the big trials against Nazis who were in the death camps were held after the Eichmann trial, which is now very important, just because of the meticulous description and thoroughness of the German courts. The fact that the trial there took some time, and that they really wrote hundreds of pages of detailed description of what was happening in death camps, that is especially important now when you have these, well, of course, deniers. You know, when all these deniers, when people say this is just an invention by the Zionists, or the invention of some other people, or that this has never happened, or that has been exaggerated. The fact that we now have lots of historic documents in German sources in trials that take a long time. I mean, you asked before about also about the accused people who are very old. So also from that point of view, if someone is over 80 years old and the trial takes a bit longer or less, that's not all that important. It's much more important that these people have to listen to the witnesses who in all detail tell what happened. And also some of the witnesses are not so very young anymore. So the fact that this is an opportunity now to put all these details before a court and to have them in detailed judgments of historic documents like that is of extreme importance. And therefore, the fact that cases take a bit longer, a bit less, that depends on the circumstances of each case.
Well, I want to thank you very much for assisting us and allowing us to interview you like this. I really do appreciate it. I don't want to take any more of your time, but the stories are, I don't know how much more, but I can take. Some of the stories just can break your heart and keep you awake for night after night, I think sometimes, just memories of the testimony.
Anyway, I'm very glad to have met you.
Oh, no.
And I wish you that your pupils a lot of success in every sphere.
But thank you. They appreciate that.